So if there is an intelligent designer, a creative force beyond all space, time, and matter, what are the properties of this entity? Theologists and metaphysicians throughout history have agreed that this intelligent creative force must by definition be all-knowing, omniscient, all-powerful, omnipotent, and all-present, omnipresent. Furthermore, by definition, if God, an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent being, exists, then we all must be a part of it. In my Asbestos Head book, I wrote, "Either God is causal, singular, and separate, an outside entity somehow responsible for his own existence, the creation of the universe, and the creation of other beings to recognize him, or existence is non-causal, plural, parts and whole of all that is, with nothing outside us, because we are all infinite, self-reflexive pieces of God, interacting, changing, acting out eternity." Many people are happy to accept the notion that God is some external entity like a bearded white man in the clouds who created us and watches over the universe like a cosmic fishbowl. Others are happy to accept that there is no God and the universe, consciousness, life, matter, space, and time are all the result of a random, spontaneous Big Bang accident. Personally, neither of these ideas have ever resonated with me, and both are relatively modern. If instead we consult the most ancient culture and the oldest texts in recorded history, the Indian Vedas, a very different story presents itself. In the beginning of the world, and though it probably had no ultimate beginning as we think of them, you have to start somewhere, there was only Brahma. Being all there was, and therefore totally known to himself, Brahma soon realized that this totality of awareness would eventually become extremely boring. After all, when you know everything there is to know, then there's no surprise, nothing to keep you interested. It's like reading the same book for the 78 millionth time. Anyway, since he was omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnipresent, all everywhere, Brahma decided to create a diversion for himself, a way of introducing the elements of surprise, intrigue, and drama into his experience. He thought, what would it be like to forget who I really am? So he invented the game of cosmic hide-and-seek. According to the rules of this game, Brahma would pretend to break pieces of himself off from the whole so that to all appearances they would seem separate. That's the hide part. Then, as the apparently separate consciousness at the center of each of those apparently separate pieces, and through their apparently separate and unique perspectives, he would seek to rediscover who he really was, which was, of course, everything.
First, I want to say that I'm actually kind of glad that Eric Dubay put out this video, because it actually does a pretty good job of summarizing the essential belief system of Eastern philosophy, that is, monism or oneism, and also how this belief system is in direct contrast to biblical monotheism. That much I'd absolutely agree with. At the same time, however, there's a number of points found in this expression and defense of monistic spirituality which reveal their own startling self-contradictions and become quite problematic when applying these beliefs to actual practical living in the real world. Eric first explains that in the beginning, God or Brahman, the all-knowing, all-being, all-present source, was all there was, but consequently became bored with his all-knowing existence and thus decided to fracture himself into a zillion tiny expressions of himself, a multitude of polarized and amnesiac splinters of the divine. Because this way there would be change to the monotony of being God. Millions of different stories to experience through millions of different sets of eyes, millions of different paths, interwoven, yet forgetting how it was all set in motion in the first place. He describes this as a cosmic game of hide-and-seek, the divine hiding his own divinity from himself for the ultimate pleasure of eventually getting to rediscover himself and put himself back together again. And so from this vantage point, the individual sets out to discover deeper spiritual truth by simply learning to realize their interconnectedness to the whole, to embrace their own forgotten inner divinity, their true identity as being a tiny drop in the divine ocean. Now, on a certain level, this actually sounds quite reasonable to a good number of people, and more importantly, it sounds more appealing in its approach to issues like morality, especially when compared to those Abrahamic religions, particularly biblical Christianity. But it is this point of morality where Eastern monism begins to really trip over its own supposedly godlike feet. If the physical world is merely all illusion which sprang forth from the source consciousness, for the purpose of that consciousness being able to then experience something new by way of dividing itself and thus temporarily wiping its own memory, then indeed there is no such thing as true good or true evil. Such polarized concepts are ultimately one of countless other examples of duality, and duality is merely a conceptual requirement for those individual experiences. Without duality, there is no, quote, story. So the mystics claim that Brahman, God, was bored and thus felt compelled to hide himself in the story and forget his all-powerful godhood. But then what we all ultimately need to do is to turn around and forget the story too, which was supposed to be the whole reason for the creation in the first place, and to then ascend beyond dualistic thinking back to remembering that all is one again. It sounds like a weird merry-go-round. Well, it is. Of course, the mystics will quickly reply, but of course, everything is cyclical, that's the whole point. To which I say, yes, you believe in an endless cycle of forgetting who you are, and then calling it enlightenment. And so, what does it really mean to ascend beyond the so-called, quote, illusion of duality? It means that to truly adhere to this kind of teaching, you must eventually confess that there is no right or wrong, no good or evil, as I already mentioned. No such thing as sin, just error, just ignorance. And again, this sounds good to a lot of people, but it gets much more difficult to actually live in accordance with it, especially when you're not hiding in your meditative trance, but you then stand up and have to go interact with the rest of the world. What this kind of teaching ultimately says is that every quote-unquote bad action or experience out there is merely just the divine story playing itself out, merely just the temporary duality, required in order to bring the all back into the realization of its allness. So, when innocent people are murdered, lives are destroyed, property is stolen, prisoners are tortured, young children are sexually violated, certain races of people are oppressed by slavery, nations crushed by tyranny, and humanity as a whole is deceived and exploited and dehumanized by the powers that shouldn't be. This is not really evil. This is not sin. These are not crimes. It's not wickedness. It's just merely ignorance. The dualistic workings of a self-fractured divinity who's telling a story to itself, through itself, all for the sake of forgetting that very same story and remembering that it was just an illusion. This becomes an even more poignant piece of self-evident contradiction with a figure such as Dubay, who's constantly lamenting the New World Order, or Jew World Order, I suppose in his case. Never mind the fact that he seems blissfully unaware of the fact that those, quote, Jews, who he constantly accuses of faking the Holocaust and perpetrating the entire globalist conspiracy, are in fact Kabbalists. And this tiny detail really flies in the face of his whole claim that the Bible is a fabricated propaganda tool of the NWO. Never mind that according to his own worldview, those, quote, evil actions of the Rothschilds and Freemasons and Jesuits aren't actually evil at all. They're simply necessary elements of the dualistic drama. Won't karma eventually straighten them all out as well, and manage to bring them to the realization of their own inner divinity too, connected to the whole? But see, this is where the irony really gets interesting, because in reality, those Kabbalistic Rothschilds and secret society Masons and Rosicrucians and Jesuits, they fully believe in karma themselves, and only in a far more honest and fully realized degree. Because here's the kicker about the doctrines of karma and reincarnation, the part that the gurus and yogis won't ever tell you, especially if you're a Westerner newly discovering these ancient teachings. As nice of an idea as karma might sound to people, and as preferable to harsh Christian ideas of sin and judgment it might seem, The flip side to karma and reincarnation is that suffering is rendered meaningless and temporary, and what's worse, a person's current suffering is viewed as the result of a person's past life. So, if a person is suffering, if a person is born into a situation of poverty or oppression, then they must have deserved it. In truth, karma actually reinforces the oppression of poor and powerless people in society. Don't believe me? Well, just ask the millions of the untouchables living within the caste system of India to this day. Does this image look at all familiar to you? Do you recognize a similar pattern here to any other hierarchical structures that you've seen anywhere else? According to karma, the quote elites of the New World Order actually have every right to oppress you, merely by the fact that they were born into the position of being able to do so. The universe itself has declared it to be so. According to the laws of karma, these detested elites have obviously progressed further in their cosmic game of hide and seek to even be in those privileged elite positions in the first place. Do you see the problem? Is it really hard to understand all this once we stop and realize that their occult belief systems are really the same monistic, New Age belief systems being preached by guys like Dubay? It's really all the same self-delusioned lie, coming from the same Luciferian source. And now, here is the final test, the final point. There have been so many teachers of these ancient Eastern mystical beliefs, so many proponents of monism through the centuries. Many people today even try to make Jesus into one of them as well because he said, "I and the Father are one." What they always fail to include is the following line, where Jesus also said, "No one comes to the Father but by me." So, the Indian sage, Sri Ramana Maharishi, he died April 14th, 1950 at an ashram in India. He's still in his grave. The Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi, he died November 16th, 1240 in Damascus. He is still in his grave. The beloved Hindu philosopher Adi Shankara, he died in the year 820 AD in the Himalayas. He is still in his grave. But Jesus of Nazareth, he died on a cross on a hill outside of Jerusalem. His grave is empty.